Hello from the Heartland. My name is Jenna, and this is SmartHER News. News when it matters and why it matters. Our SmartHER series features unique people who help us think and live smarter. Today, we're going to do something different. So often, the news delivers an avalanche of information, dates and data, names and places, without enough of a pause to really explain why it all matters and what exactly we should remember. This is why I believe less is more, because often the story behind one name can tell us so much. And this is true of the story of Mike Spann. We should remember Mike Spann. Mike Spann is a name you should remember because after 9/11, he was the very first American killed in combat in the War on Terror. The very first one. He served in the CIA and was one of the first Americans on the ground in Afghanistan after the September 11th attacks. His goal was to help track down those terrorists responsible for murdering thousands of Americans. Now, in Afghanistan, right before he died, Mike Spann came into contact with another history-making American, a name you should also know, but for very different reasons, John Walker Lindh. John Walker Lindh is the first American-born enemy combatant in the War on Terror. Enemy combatant simply means an American accused of fighting for the enemy. He was taken into custody in Afghanistan, brought back to the United States, and convicted of supporting the Taliban. He served 17 years of a 20-year sentence. This past Memorial Day in 2019, he was released early for good behavior. His family denies he's a terrorist. Others, obviously, disagree. Big picture, there are others like John Walker Lindh, Americans behind bars for their role with or supporting terrorist organizations or terrorist acts who will walk free. How we handle their release may determine how safe we live. Now, over the years, John Walker Lindh has received, arguably, far more attention than Mike Spann. But we're going to change that today. We're going to change that today for you because we are going to remember Mike Spann. Because Mike's story and sacrifice matter. His story is America's story. He's the very first one on a list of those who made the ultimate sacrifice in combat zones since September 11th, 2001. That list of those killed in action, as you know, is long now and growing still. Today, Mike's daughter, Alison, will provide us a unique opportunity to get a glimpse into her father's life. She continues to fight to keep her dad's remarkable story alive, a story of one American man, one American family, a story of sacrifice, and a story that helps raise larger questions about how we fight the war on terror in the past, present, and in the future, both abroad and at home. Here's Alison.
I was a military kid, so I kind of grew up everywhere. I always feel like a nomad or, kind of a misfit. But my family home base is in Northwest Alabama, just because my grandparents have always been there in this little town called Winfield, where my dad grew up. But we've lived everywhere. We started out in Quantico, then we moved to Oklahoma, then we moved to Okinawa, Japan, then back to North Carolina. And then we were in Washington, D.C. when everything sort of started going haywire, I guess you could say. My dad was killed in November of 2001, and then my mom died a month and 3 days later in December of 2001.
Oh my gosh. So you said when things started to go a little haywire. So why don't we just go into that? What do you mean by go a little haywire?
So just things within my family. My parents split up when we moved to Washington, D.C. And then 9/11 happened. I guess even before 9/11, my mom was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. Then September 11th happened. My dad went overseas. And I guess it all kind of happened in such fast succession in that year.
We have to remember, and I want to remind our audience, is that you were 8, 9 years old when all of this happened?
Yes.
And that must have been watching the perspective. We have to remember what September 11th was like. And I think sometimes we sort of forget about it, how terrifying that event was, no matter where you were in the country, but particularly in areas where the attacks were so visceral and so real, like in Washington, D.C. What do you remember most about that moment in time as a 9-year-old?
Yeah, I think that the impact of that day really speaks for itself, and that I was only 9 years old, but I remember everything about that day. Absolutely everything. I remember what my stepmother made for dinner that night. So I went to school that day, and we lived in Manassas Park, which was probably a 45-minute commute outside of the city. And throughout the day, kids kept leaving class. People kept getting checked out of school. And by the time recess came around, there were only 3 of us left in the classroom. And so we knew that something was up, but we didn't know what it was. I know a lot of these schools played the news for the students. This school that I was in did not do that. So we were in the dark the whole day, but we did know that something was amiss. So I go through the school day. There's only 3 of us in the classroom, and I get off the school bus, and my best friend Kelsey, who was our neighbor, was waiting for me at the bus stop, and she was completely out of breath. And she said, "Okay, I knew you were coming from the bus, so I ran up here. Someone flew a plane into the Empire State Building." And then she took off running back down to her house. So I take off running to my house, and I'm out of breath. I knock on the door, and my dad answers. And I knew then something was wrong, that he was home from work that early. So I spew out to him, "Kelsey just told me someone flew into the Empire State Building." And he's like, "No, that's wrong. Come inside." And he sat me down in front of the news, and we pretty much watched the news for the rest of the night. My stepmother made calzones for dinner, and I talked on the phone with my mother that night about what happened. And she was kind of a little upset that my dad had let me see everything on the news and was really keeping me in the loop about what was happening. She was very protective, whereas my dad always wanted me to be informed no matter what it was. That was kind of a big thing for him. You know, you need to know what's going on in the world, whether it be good or whether it be bad. But that night, you know, watching that footage as a 9-year-old, you don't really know what it means or what's going on, but you know that something's not right.
You said that your dad was home from work
Right.
early, and that was a sign for you. What was he doing at the time?
So he was a CIA officer at the time, and CIA was actually evacuated that day. And so that brought him home early from work. You know, he was never home when I got home from school. He, you know, worked until 6, and he had an hour commute or longer back in DC traffic. So for him to be home, you know, was just another sign that something wasn't right.
And he wasn't always part of the CIA, right? How did he begin his military service that brought you to so many different places in the country and in the world?
Yeah. So actually, when my father was killed, the local library in Winfield, Alabama, where my dad grew up, gave my grandmother a book about the CIA that my dad had checked out when he was in high school. And it was back when you would still write in the front of the book your name and the date that you checked it out. So from early on, my dad knew that eventually he wanted a career in the CIA. But he went to college. He went to Auburn for 4 years, and he graduated in criminal justice, or he got a degree in criminal justice, and then immediately joined the Marine Corps. He was in the Marine Corps for 8 years. He was a captain. And after 8 years in the Marine Corps, he finally decided to make that jump to CIA. I was so young at the time. I remember they came. We lived in Jacksonville, North Carolina, right before my dad entered the CIA. So he was stationed at Camp Lejeune. And I remember them coming to our house for an interview with him. And I remember the move to DC and all that stuff. But at the time, I didn't know that it was an interview for CIA. I actually thought my dad worked for the State Department until he was killed.
So let's fast forward then a little bit, because the time between September and November is not that long, but a lot happens. So walk us through, again, from the perspective of a 9-year-old, but also from what you know now, what was your dad's journey to Afghanistan like?
So, you know, I don't really know much about exactly what led him there. I was 9, but the way he explained it to me as a 9-year-old is, I have to go over there so that they don't come here and commit another act like September 11th. So, you know, for me, I'm thinking he's going over there to fight all these guys that carried out September 11th, which is exactly what he was going to do. And that was scary. As a 9-year-old, I did not want my dad to go. He had been going places my entire life. He was gone a lot with not only the CIA, but also the Marine Corps. He was deployed a lot. So I was used to that, but I had never been scared or fearful of him going anywhere like I was when he told me he was going to Afghanistan. And I think a lot of that probably has to do with what we all witnessed on September 11th. When you see something like that and then know that your dad's going over there with people who did those things, it's really scary.
Absolutely.
I think for my dad, he was just the type of person where that was his duty. That was his calling. He felt that in order to protect his family, that was something that he had to do. I've often thought, because my mother was extremely ill by this point, I think every adult in my life knew that she wasn't going to make it. I still, naively thought that she would survive. And I've often looked back and thought, gee, like with my mom being so ill, why would my dad leave, putting himself at risk to also leave us, without any parents. And I just think that my dad felt such a calling to go over there. I don't think anything could have kept him from going.
Tell us about what you now know about how your father died.
So it's been a bit of a journey, especially recently. When everything happened when I was 9, I was told bits and pieces. I actually even traveled over to Afghanistan, and I was in Mazar-i-Sharif. I went to Qala-i-Jangi, the prison that he was killed in. I stayed with General Dostum, who my dad worked with over there. But still, everyone has a different story of what happened. My grandfather has done a lot of digging, and he's talked to a lot of people. And so I know most of my information from my grandfather. Now, I've had several of my dad's colleagues reach out to me in recent weeks saying, if you want to know anything about your dad, I was over there with him. And so I think that's going to be really interesting for me to actually get to talk to them and hear firsthand information. But from what I know, my dad was part of an elite CIA team called the Alpha Team, and they were dropped into Afghanistan alone with really no military backup. They were alone there for 3 days before military backup was dropped into the country as well. On the day he died, he and one of his team members, a man named Dave, went to a prison located in Mazar-i-Sharif, Afghanistan, called Qala-i-Jangi, where a bunch of captured Taliban and Al-Qaeda members were being held. So the CIA at the time was working in conjunction with the Northern Alliance, who were Afghan community members who were fighting Taliban rule in the country. And it was the Northern Alliance fighters who had captured these terrorists. So they didn't do a very thorough job of patting these guys down, figuring out what exactly they had on them. So we know they had a lot of weapons hidden in their garb, and they were being held in a tiny little building inside the prison. So the prison, when you go see it, it's huge, and it's like this huge mud structure. A lot of buildings over there are constructed in this fashion. And inside there's this pink building. It's tiny in comparison to the rest of the prison, and that's where these guys are being held, and they're being brought out one by one, or in small groups at a time, for my dad to interview them and try to figure out what they could about Osama bin Laden and his whereabouts. So then there's video of all of this. There's video of my dad interviewing a lot of these people, including John Walker Lindh. And in some of the video footage that we've seen, my dad's interviewing a prisoner, and you can hear sort of an explosion or a pop in the background. And that's when that sets everything into motion. But essentially, while they were in the pink house, these prisoners concocted an uprising. They started setting off grenades. They started pulling their guns out, shooting, and it was mass chaos. It was mass chaos inside the prison at that point.
And the pink house was the area where your dad was doing the interrogations?
So he was outside the pink house in the surrounding area, but the prisoners were being held inside there. and they were coming out of that building for questioning. That's where they were being brought out from.
Got it. So the uprising's happening, chaos breaks out. It's a lot of prisoners, by the way, compared to the amount of actual CIA agents / military members that are on the ground.
Right. They were severely outnumbered, for sure.
So what happened?
So my dad, this is kind of what we've gathered from video footage and what his partner Dave said. There were 2 doctors on scene with Dave and my dad who were offering care to some of the prisoners who wanted it or who would accept it. And according to accounts, my dad immediately started shooting back. Dave and the 2 doctors take off running. Dave said he looked back and the last thing he saw was my dad sort of disappear under a pile of prisoners. And that's the last Dave ever saw of my dad alive. Dave and the 2 doctors, they ran to somewhere safe. I can't remember if it was within the prison or just outside. There's video of Dave on the phone trying to call in for backup. And eventually some came, but I know that it was a topic of debate whether or not they go in there and find my dad because it was mass chaos and they had absolutely zero control over what was happening.
Did Dave survive?
Dave did.
I think this is an important story for so many reasons. One is there's often a question of, well, when did the war on terror really begin? And, we could say 9/11, we could say before that. Mm-hmm. But what your dad became in American history is the first American killed in combat in the war on terror in Afghanistan. And so that is forever something that is attached to his legacy beyond just his incredible service to this country. And you mentioned that in the last few weeks that you've had some of his colleagues come forward to want to share more of this story with you. And there's a reason why his story has come back up in the news as of late and will continue to, I would imagine. And you mentioned that name, John Walker Lindh. And I'm sure you can tell our audience John Walker Lindh's story better than I, but just a few basics. This was a American citizen who was actually raised not too far from where I grew up in San Francisco, in a really nice suburb of the Bay Area. And in high school, he decides to pursue religious study of Islam. And so he travels overseas. He finds himself in a few different areas, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and also eventually in this prison where your father is. What do you think people should know about John Walker Lindh and how he relates to the story of your father?
So this is, I think, a common misconception about John Walker Lindh. He's often called the American Taliban. I think it needs to be made clear to everybody that John Walker Lindh was training with Al-Qaeda. Now, Al-Qaeda is the group that planned and carried out September 11th. They're responsible for the deaths of over 3,000 people on American soil. And that is who John Walker Lindh was training with. That needs to be made very clear to everybody, first and foremost.
Let me underscore that. I don't want to interrupt you too much because I really want to hear what you say on this. But this is such an important point. And when I saw you making this point in interviews, Alison, this is one of the reasons why I said I have to talk to her. Because in all of my research, when it comes to terrorism, there are lots of different quote unquote intellectuals that want to separate the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, say that they're completely different, they're not the same. And you very clearly, in such an eloquent way just right now, just stated something that's really important, that even though the United States government lists Al-Qaeda as a terrorist organization and doesn't do the same for the Taliban, some of the smartest people in this space don't think that distinction is important and that we need to tell the story more as these groups link together to work against the West, specifically the United States. So I just wanted to make sure that our audience knew that as well. It's such a crucial point that you just made. You were saying the second thing that we should know about John Walker Lindh is what?
No, I agree with you. I think it's such an important point that we make that distinction and we let people know exactly who he was training with. It wasn't just some terrorist organization across the seas. It was the terrorist organization that planned the most horrific attack on American soil and kicked this whole thing off. And furthermore, John Walker Lindh has admitted that he knew of 2 groups who were coming to the United States to carry out attacks. He knew that. He stayed. He knew the September 11th attacks had been carried out. He still stayed with these groups. He was there before, the attacks were planned, while they were being planned, and after they had been carried out. And the way that his family, or particularly his father, tries to tell the story, their narrative is John Walker Lindh was on a religious quest to find out more about Islam, and he just stumbled into an Al-Qaeda training camp. I think that is such a slap in the face for actual religious scholars. You don't accidentally stumble into an Al-Qaeda training camp.
Well, and you've actually been in Afghanistan, which is important. The terrain does not lend itself to stumbling in anywhere.
No.
I mean, I don't mean to laugh at it, but it's not like you just walk down the street and suddenly you're in a different playground. It's a very rural, very rugged terrain. And with these particular groups that he was traveling with, they were in very specific areas.
Right. And, another thing that I think debunks that narrative is that I don't know if you've seen the video footage, but there is video footage of my dad interviewing John Walker Lindh. And it's very apparent at the very beginning of the video that my dad knows that John Walker Lindh is from the West somewhere. He asked him, "Where are you from? Do you speak English?" Repeatedly trying to get information from him. He offers aid. He tries to explain to John Walker Lindh, the groups that you're with carried out the September 11th attacks. There were Muslims in the towers that day. Does the Quran teach that? John Walker Lindh was silent throughout this entire thing. He never said a word to my dad. So to paint the picture of this young kid who got lost on his religious quest and was so desperate to get out and was so desperate to help, that doesn't jive with the video that we see of him being offered help by an American and turning it down by not speaking.
And one of the things that I read, and you can correct this if this is wrong, that your grandfather has talked about as well, that if there was an uprising planned in the prison, the uprising that killed your father, that John Walker Lindh also had an opportunity to share that information with your dad, or even give any sort of indication that something was up. And that has bothered your grandfather, from my understanding, for years.
The whole family. That's really my biggest concern with John Walker Lindh, and that's why I don't believe the narrative that his family puts out. If he was really lost, if he was really scared of the group that he was with, if he really didn't agree with what they were doing, when my dad asked him the very first question, and it was so obvious that he was an American, John Walker Lindh would have said, "My name is John Walker Lindh. I'm from California. I'm here with these groups. I want help. This is what they have planned. Let's get out of here." I mean, anybody who is supposedly in that situation, who's scared, who doesn't want to be with the group that they're with, who's so terrified as his dad tries to paint the picture, that's exactly what they would do. They would jump at the opportunity of an American, a fellow American offering help, and he didn't do that. Not only did he not tell my dad of the prison uprising that was about to happen, he didn't say anything. He chose to stay silent. He chose not to say a single word. And that, to me, is evidence enough that he was not only a part of those groups, but he was in on the prison uprising. He knew it was going to happen, and he didn't care.
So now one of the reasons why we're talking about John Walker Lindh is what has transpired in the last several years. And I'm just going to kind of breeze through a couple of these details. John Walker Lindh is eventually detained by American forces. He comes back home to the United States. He faces trial for a number of different reasons. He's not tried in some of the harshest charges that could be waged against him. And I can explain a little bit of that later. But he ends up going to prison. And just this past Memorial Day, right before Memorial Day weekend, he is released early, just a few years early, but early from what would be 20 years behind bars. And what is interesting, you're a journalist, Alison, and one of the things that's always interesting, you take a step back from these stories, is I see your two families, these two American families linked forever. You have your father, the first American killed in combat in the War on Terror. You have John Walker Lindh, who is the first American born detainee in the War on Terror. And as of today, he's free. Under surveillance, probation, he has certain restrictions. But talk to us about what that's been like to witness that and to see him, now he's in his late 30s, serve time, and now free. What do you think?
First of all, the 20-year sentence was never something that we agreed was appropriate punishment for what he had done, not only to my family and to my dad, but to the entire country. I feel that he also has responsibility in what happened on September 11th. He was with these groups. He admitted that he knew of two groups at least that had come over to carry out some kind of attack on American soil. So the 20-year sentence to me was never appropriate, but that's the way that it went down. That's the way that it worked. The being released 3 years early because he was given credit or time served for good behavior is really the most shocking part of all of this, especially in light of reports that we've seen that he has continued to advocate for global jihad. He has continued to translate violent extremist texts. To me, that's not good behavior. What scale are we using in our prison system to judge good behavior? Is good behavior not causing fights within the prison? Is good behavior not giving the prison guards any trouble? Or is good behavior keeping everything, you're a good prisoner, you're doing everything that you're supposed to do in prison? Because to me, the translation of violent extremist texts and the advocating for global jihad while still behind bars doesn't equate to good behavior. So I think that we need to take a cold, hard look at exactly how they judged John Walker Lindh's good behavior in prison, because he's one of many that are set to be released in the next few years. And I don't think any of them deserve time served for good behavior. Even if he was a model prisoner, even if he wasn't advocating for global jihad and he wasn't still continuing to translate these texts, I don't think that he deserves or deserved to get out 3 years early.
Well, you touched on so many important things there. And one of them is almost like we have this story about John Walker Lindh, and then we have the bigger picture, which is that we have these dozens of what some refer to as homegrown terrorists, but there's a debate about that term, dozens to hundreds of people in American prisons that are there because of terrorism charges, and a big question about how we're going to handle their release, because we don't have any sort of a process. We're kind of in this new era of the war on terror and what that means. And I'm just curious your thoughts, not only with such a personal connection, but also as a journalist now. Look how you have applied your experience and your skills in a way to help tell America's story. What you think Americans should know about this time and place that we're living in when it comes to how we're going to provide security for our friends and family.
Look, my goal with all of this, we knew that the chances of John Walker Lindh having to serve those 3 years were very slim. Between the time we found out and the time that he was set to be released was only 2 months. So there wasn't a lot of time to do anything legally. My goal since coming to that realization and coming to peace with that was, what are we going to do for the future? What are we going to do for the rest that we have who are still behind bars? We're sort of at the second stage of this war, in that they've served their time, they were sentenced, and now what happens when they're released? And I think that it's so important that we do have these conversations and we do try to figure out what is the next step. How do we proceed after this? Because the restrictions that were placed on John Walker Lindh were placed after my grandfather and I started speaking out. And the things that were placed on him, a monitoring of his internet access and all the things, should have been common sense restrictions that were just on him because of his status and what he had been behind bars for, and they weren't. And so I think that if this is important to you, if this is something that you feel is a big issue, if security is something that's important in your life, you need to be calling your representatives, you need to be calling your senators, and you need to be demanding that they get together and figure out a plan on how to take care of these people. It's very concerning to me, just based on the fact that John Walker Lindh was able to do the things he was able to do while still behind bars. So he was in a very highly monitored prison and was still able to do these things. So yes, while he has restrictions in the outside world, who's to say that you can't monitor somebody for 24 hours a day? that's just not realistic. So what are we going to do to combat this problem?
It's a big question and big stakes, which is, I think, what you were just about to say.
Yeah, it's high stakes. You're dealing with these people who have committed atrocities against their fellow human beings. And while many of their victims are dead and will never see the light of day again, they got slapped with a light sentence. And now they're about to be released into the outside world. Do we think that they've changed? Do we think that they are now reformed? I think that John Walker Lindh, at least for himself, is a good example. He wasn't, he's not. I wrote a letter and I sent it to a lot of any representative or any senator that I thought had prior military experience or who was from the state of Alabama, and just talking with them. And finally, Bradley Byrne has bipartisan support on a bill that is no leniency for terrorists, meaning that they can't get credit for time served for good behavior. I think that's a step in the right direction, but I do think this is an important conversation. It's something that we need to be talking about, and I think it's something that we aren't talking about enough. During the week of John Walker Lindh's release, I was interviewed a lot. My grandfather was interviewed a lot. People were talking about it. Now I feel, it's one of those things that it was hot in the news for a week, and now no one's talking about it. And I'm afraid that it's not going to be brought up again until the next person is set to be released.
We should really underscore that. The release of these there's almost like two different groups. You have the immediate few dozen that are going to be released. Those are going to be released in the next several years. It's imminent. It's not just like this is in 10 years. It's happening right now into American culture, into American society. That's what's going on. And then you have the longer question of, are we even handling this appropriate as we continue to watch the war on terror evolve? Because that's what seems to be happening, evolving instead of ending. Here's just a final question for you. And I think this is important to what you just said, which is that you don't want people just to see this and let it go, just pass them by. And we often see that hashtag, never forget. People talk about that a lot, but it means something different for those that are connected to the military. It just does. I mean, I have that experience. I know that you do as well. If you could tell someone in just a few sentences how to remember your dad so that they always remember this conversation and have this in the forefront of their mind, what would you tell them?
I think when people think of Mike Spann and people like him, members of our military, members of our intelligence services who risk everything to protect us, I think you need to remember a man who told his 9-year-old daughter, I am going over there to protect you so that they don't come over here and hurt you again, like they did on September 11th, so they don't bring this fight to American soil ever again. That's really what we're still dealing with right now. My dad went over there to prevent people like John Walker Lindh from being free on American soil, from being free to carry out these horrific attacks and carry out their jihad. And I think that when you remember Mike Spann and you remember people like him, you need to remember people who risk it all to go over there. And remembering that, don't let it be in vain. Don't let it be that they went over there and they sacrificed and they put these people away. And then 20 years later, they're on our streets again. 20 years later, they're walking free. In 30 years, what's the story going to be? Are we going to have another September 11th? We don't need to let the sacrifices of these men and women be in vain, because that is what we're teetering on right now. If we don't get a plan of action, if we don't continue their fight to protect ourselves, to protect our country, then we're looking at potentially horrible effects of that. And I think everyone needs to remember that. You need to remember the day that you saw those planes fly into those buildings. You need to remember in the weeks following when you saw news coverage of our young men and women being killed overseas and what that felt like, and not wanting to go back to something like that. Because at the end of the day, these people went and they knew that they may never come home. They may never see their families again, but they felt such a duty to the American people and to this country that they went over there and sacrificed it all. And it takes a special kind of person to do that. I just feel so strongly that we cannot let those sacrifices be in vain.
Well, we're grateful for your father's service, grateful and proud of him, Alison, proud of him too. And we're grateful and proud of you. And grateful that you were able to share your story with us. Even just a small slice of it really illuminates such an important picture that we all need to know about. So thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you guys so much for talking with me and for covering this story. I really appreciate it.
Quick, concise, nonpartisan, SmartHER news, a refuge from the storm. I'm Jenna. Thank you for choosing SmartHER.